Welcome back to Golo Nightmare. Every search report in that forest ended before dark. I used to think it was just procedure. Then one night, the search kept going, and the report didn't. Now I know why. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy realistic horror stories. Now turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and listen carefully. I was incident commander on the search that nobody finished, and I am the reason it has a daylight report and nothing else. And I have decided I am going to tell it the way it happened in the field, instead of the way it reads on paper, because the paper is a lie I helped write, and I am tired of being the only living person who knows where the lie starts. Let me give you the shape of the job first, because the horror of this doesn't land unless you understand how ordinary the work is. I spent 16 years running search and rescue in a national forest. I won't name. Big country. The kind of place where a person can step 40 feet off a trail to relieve themselves and never be seen again. When somebody goes overdue, there's a machine that turns on, and I was one of the people who ran the machine. You establish a point last seen. You build a probability map. You divide the ground into sectors, and you assign teams, and you log everything, because a search is a legal event as much as a humanitarian one, and the documentation matters. Who searched where, when, with what result? Every team checks in by radio on a schedule. Every sector gets marked cleared or not cleared. There's an incident command post, usually a folding table and a couple of trucks at a trailhead, and there's an operations log that runs the whole time the search is active, timestamp after timestamp, in somebody's careful block printing. I had run dozens of these. I was good at it. I tell you that not to brag, but because it's relevant to how slowly I understood what I'm about to describe. A person who is good at a system stops seeing the system. It becomes water to a fish. And the thing about this forest searches, the thing that had been true the whole time I worked there, and that I never once noticed until it was too late, is that they ended at the same time. Not the same clock time, the same light. Every search I ever ran, the operations log has a final entry, and that final entry, every single time, falls in the window between sunset and full dark. Sometimes the missing person was found before then, alive or dead, and the log ends naturally. But sometimes the person was not found, and the search continued through the night, and I have stood at a command post at 2 a.m. with teams in the field and a helicopter inbound, and yet the operations log, the official one, the one that goes in the file, stops at dusk, every time. I want to be honest that for most of my career this didn't register as strange, because there was a procedure that explained it, or seemed to. Standard practice taught to me by the man who trained me, a grizzled old incident commander named Walt Brennan, was that we closed the daylight log at last light and ran nighttime operations off book until morning. Walt explained it to me as a liability thing. He said night searches are dangerous, that the agency didn't want a paper trail of decisions made in the dark that a lawyer could pick apart later, that anything we did after sunset we'd reconstruct and formalize in the morning when we could think straight. It sounded plausible. It sounded like the kind of arse-covering institutions actually do. So for 16 years, when the light went, I closed the log, and I ran the night, and in the morning I wrote it up clean, daylight only, and I never wrote down a single thing that happened between dusk and dawn. Nobody did. It was just how it was done. Walt did it. Walt's predecessor did it. It went back further than anyone could say. The reason I'm telling you all this from the field and not from an archive is that I didn't figure this out by reading old files. I figured it out the hard way, on the ground, on one search, the last one I ever ran, and I need you to be standing there with me when it happens instead of reading about it after. The missing person was a man named Daniel Frey. 53, an engineer from out of state, divorced, the kind of methodical solo backpacker who is normally the last person to need rescuing. His sister reported him overdue. We pulled his trip plan from the trailhead register, which he'd filled out completely, the way careful men do route, dates, the works. He'd told his sister he was doing a 4-day loop, and he was a day past his out date with no word. I remember his sister on the phone, her voice doing that thing where someone is trying very hard to sound reasonable so that you'll take them seriously. She told me he carried a little brass compass that had been their father's, that he never went anywhere without it, that he'd taught himself to navigate with it as a kind of hobby, and she kept saying, "He doesn't get lost. He doesn't get lost," as if the repetition could make it true. I told her we'd find him. I believed it. Men like Daniel Frey turn up cold and embarrassed 90% of the time. We mobilized at first light. By midday, we had a full operation running. 2 K9 teams, 4 ground teams of 3, a helicopter with thermal for an evening pass. The command post set up at the loop trailhead with me running ops, and a young ranger named Priya Sandoval keeping the operations log. Priya was new, sharp, the kind of detail-obsessed person you want on a log because she'd note the time you sneezed. That detail matters, because Priya is the other person who knows part of what I know, and Priya is the reason I couldn't do the thing I'd always done. We caught a break in the afternoon. One of the dog teams hit on a glove near a creek crossing about 3 miles in, and then a ground team found a partial boot print in mud a quarter-mile up drainage, sized right, tread consistent with the boots his sister had described. It pulled our probability map hard toward a side drainage that wasn't on the main loop, a steep little canyon the locals called the Slot, narrow and deep and signal dead, the kind of place where a man following a compass bearing instead of a trail could absolutely end up. We pushed 2 teams toward the mouth of the Slot. The afternoon was burning down, and I felt the thing every IC feels at that hour, the pressure of the light, because we were close, the sign was fresh, the dog was interested, and the sun was going to be behind the ridge in 90 minutes. Walt had retired 2 years before this. He'd had a stroke and was in a care facility a couple hours away, mostly nonverbal by then. So the man who would normally have been at my shoulder telling me to close the log at last light wasn't there. It was my call, and I made the call that I'd been trained to make, which was that we'd keep searching after dark because we had fresh sign, but that I'd close the operations log at sunset per standard practice and run the night off book. And Priya, keeping the log, looked up at me when I said it and asked the question that unraveled everything. She asked, simply, why would we stop logging if we're still searching? If something happens to a team in the Slot at midnight, that's exactly when we'd want the record. I gave her Walt's answer, the liability answer, the dangerous decisions in the dark answer, and I heard it come out of my own mouth, and for the first time in 16 years I heard how thin it was, because she was right. If you're worried about liability, a night operation is precisely when you want airtight documentation. Closing the log at the most dangerous hours is the opposite of protecting yourself. It's the single most legally reckless thing an institution could do. I had been reciting a justification my entire career, and it was, on the most basic examination, completely backwards. I didn't have time to chase the thought, because we had teams converging on the Slot and the light was going, but it sat in me like a swallowed stone, and Priya, being Priya, did not close the log. She kept writing. I noticed her doing it around sunset, kept noticing it, the pen moving when, by all my training, it should have stopped, and I let her, partly because I couldn't articulate a real reason to make her stop, and partly because some part of me, that day, wanted to know what was on the other side of the rule I'd kept blind for 16 years. So for the first time in the history of that forest, as far as I have ever been able to determine, a search continued into full dark with the official operations log still running. Here is what happened, and I'm going to give it to you in the order it came over the radio, because that's how I lived it, and because the radio traffic is the only thing I have that I trust, since the radio recordings are the part of this they couldn't get to in time. By full dark, we had 2 teams at the Slot. Team 1, 3 searchers led by a veteran named Cole Marsh, went up the drainage bottom. Team 2 held at the mouth as anchor and relay, because the Slot was signaled dead past the first bend and we needed a human repeater. The helicopter had done its thermal pass at dusk and gone home for the night, fuel and terrain making a night flight in that canyon a non-starter. So it was ground teams and radios and headlamps, the way it's been done for 100 years. The first thing that was wrong, Cole reported about 40 minutes after full dark. He came over the relay, and Priya logged it, timestamp and all, and his voice was normal, just puzzled. He said they were finding sign, lots of it, too much of it. He said it was like Frey had walked the drainage back and forth a dozen times. Boot prints, crossing boot prints. And then he said the thing that I have replayed more times than any other sentence in my life. He said, some of these tracks are fresh, like today fresh, but some of them are old, really old. There's prints under prints. There's prints with moss starting on the edges. I see. How long has this guy been down here? Moss does not start growing on a boot print in 4 days. I told Cole to hold and document. Priya logged it. And the next transmission, maybe 10 minutes later, was Cole again, and his voice had changed. That flatness that comes into a person's voice when they're seeing something their brain hasn't categorized yet. He said they'd found a camp, not Frey's camp. Camp. He said there were the remains of multiple camps, actually. In a widening of the canyon, fire rings, some of them recent, some of them so old they were just stained rings of rock half buried in duff. He said there was gear, packs, a tent, collapsed and rotted. And he said, and Priya's hand was shaking when she wrote this. I watched it, he said. There's people down here. I see. I can see headlamps further up the canyon. There's lights up there. I think we found them. I think we found all of them. All of them. Not him. All of them. I asked him to clarify. How many lights? He didn't answer for a full minute. The relay team at the mouth came on and said they'd lost direct contact with Team 1 and were repeating fragments. And then Cole's voice came through the relay, broken up, and what came through was, not moving right. They're not, and then a gap. And then, clear as anything, the last full sentence I ever heard from Cole Marsh. I see. They're all facing the same way, and none of them are looking at us. And then the relay team, the team at the mouth of the slot, the anchor, reported that Team 1's headlamps, which they could see as a faint glow against the canyon wall up drainage, had just gone dark. All three at once, like a switch. Now. This is the moment. This is the irreversible choice, and I need to slow all the way down here, because everything in my life divides into before this and after it. The rule, the real rule, the one underneath Walt's liability story, the one I would only fully understand later, the rule, was that when the search goes wrong after dark, you do not send people in after them. You pull back to the trailhead, you wait for first light, and in the morning you go in and you recover whatever there is to recover, and you write the daylight report, and the report begins in the morning, and everything that happened in the dark simply did not happen, because there is no record of it, because no record was ever kept. The reports don't stop before dark to protect the agency from lawyers. They stop before dark because everyone who ever ran these searches learned, the way I was about to learn, that the things that happen in that forest after sunset cannot be safely written down and cannot be safely chased, and that the only people who survive a night search are the ones who hold at the trailhead and let the dark have whatever it's already taken. I knew none of that consciously in that moment. What I knew was that I had 3 searchers whose lights had just gone out in a signal-dead canyon, and one of them was Cole Marsh, who had a wife and a daughter, and who I'd known for 11 years. And every instinct I had built over 16 years said you do not abandon a downed team. You go get them. That's the whole job. That's the only thing the job is. And the relay team leader, a steady woman named Beth, came over the radio and asked me the question, the IC's question, the one only I could answer. She asked, IC, do we go in after Team 1? I want to tell you, I hesitated because I sensed something. I didn't. I hesitated because the canyon was technical and dangerous in the dark, and I was weighing whether sending Team 2 in after Team 1 was just going to give me 6 people in trouble instead of 3. That's all. Standard risk calculus. And while I was weighing it, Priya put her hand on my arm. Priya, who had been logging everything, who had kept the pen moving past the line where the pen always stopped. And she said, very quietly so the radio wouldn't catch it, Walt left me a note when I started, in the IC binder. I wasn't supposed to read it unless we ran past dark. I read it an hour ago, and she slid it across the table. It was Walt's handwriting, shaky, post-stroke, but his, and it said, if the lights go out, they are already gone. Do not send the second team. Pull everyone to the trailhead. Lock the trucks. Do not get out for any voice you recognize. In the morning it will be over, and you write that the search began at dawn. I'm sorry I never told you. There was never a way to write it down that didn't sound like madness, and a report that sounds like madness gets you removed, and then it falls to someone who doesn't know. Hold the line. B. Do not send the second team. I had Beth's voice in my ear asking permission to go save Cole. I had Walt's note under my hand telling me Cole was already gone, and that going in would only feed it. I had Priya watching me, and I had the operations log open between us, the pen still capped in Priya's other hand, the first honest log ever kept past dark in that place, and I understood this is the part that I have never been able to make anyone feel the way I felt it. I understood that whatever I decided, the record of it would exist. For the first time, that if I sent the second team and lost them, there would be a document, and if I held them back and let Cole's light stay dark, there would also be a document. That I was about to do the unprecedented thing, which was not the searching and not the dying, both of which had clearly happened in that canyon for 100 years, but the writing it down. I made the choice. I keyed the radio, and I told Beth to pull Team 2 back to the trailhead immediately, abandon the slot, abandon Team 1, do not pursue. I told all teams to return to the command post and stay in their vehicles. I gave the order that every instinct in my body screamed was cowardice and abandonment and the worst thing a search commander can do. And Beth, God bless her, did not argue, because Beth had run searches in that forest for 20 years, and some part of her had been waiting her whole career for an IC to finally say that out loud, and I heard the relief in her voice, and the relief is the thing that told me Walt's note was true. And then I did the thing I have never told anyone until now. I did not close the log. Priya looked at me to see if I'd order it shut, the way every IC before me had, and I shook my head, and I told her to keep writing, all of it. Cole's transmissions, the moss on the prints, the camps, the headlamps facing the same way, the lights going dark, my order to abandon the team, all of it. In the official operations log, in ink, with timestamps. The first complete nighttime search record in the history of that forest. We held at the trailhead the rest of the night. I'm not going to dress up what that was like. The voices started maybe 2 hours before dawn. Out in the dark past the trucks, Cole's voice calling for help, calling my name, sounding exactly like a man who'd been hurt and was scared and couldn't understand why his commander wouldn't come for him. Walt's note said, "Do not get out for any voice you recognize." And I sat in that truck with my hand on the door handle and Cole Marsh begging me by name to come help him. And I did not open the door. And that is a thing I will carry until I die, regardless of whether it was the right call. And I have never decided whether it was the right call. The not deciding is its own kind of life sentence. At first light it stopped, the way Walt said it would. We went into the slot at full daylight, properly, by the book. We found the old camps, real, decades of them, the archaeology of every team and every lost hiker that Canyon had ever swallowed, going back further than our records went. We found gear with name tapes I recognized from cases I'd worked years before, people I'd written up as not located, search suspended, whose families I'd called. We did not find Cole, or his 2 team members, or Daniel Frey. We found their packs. We found 3 headlamps, switched off, set in a neat row on a flat rock, which no one had set there, because the team that would have set them there never came back out. We did not find a single body, then or ever. We never do. That's the other half of why the reports look the way they look. You cannot write recovered, nothing, repeatedly, for 100 years in an official document and keep your job and keep the public coming to the forest. So the institution learned to make the searches end at dusk, on paper, with the person simply not located, and let the daylight language of suspended and unresolved cover the place where the truth should be. Here's what happened to the record, and this is the part that I think about most. Because this is the part that tells me the thing in that forest and the institution that manages it are not separate problems but the same problem wearing 2 faces. I came out of that canyon with Priya's operations log, a complete one, 41 time-stamped entries past sunset, Cole's transmissions in her precise block printing, the order to abandon the team, signed with my initials. The first true document of what that place does. I drove it straight to the regional office. I did not let it out of my hands. I made 2 photocopies on the way and mailed one to myself and gave one to Priya because I am not a fool, or I thought I wasn't. The regional office took the log. They were very kind about it. They put me on administrative leave, standard after a line of duty loss. 3 searchers dead is a serious event. There was a critical incident review. And the final report of that review, which I have read, which is a public document, says that the search for Daniel Frey was initiated at dawn, that 3 searchers, Cole Marsh and 2 others, died in a fall in technical terrain in the Slot Canyon during daylight operations, that their bodies were not recovered due to the hazardous nature of the drainage, and that the search was suspended at last light per standard practice. It says the operations were conducted in daylight. It says the log was closed at sunset. There is no Priya note. There is no moss on the prints. There are no camps. There are no headlamps facing the same way. There is no order to abandon a living team. The 41 entries past sunset are gone, and the official log ends, in Priya's handwriting, which they kept because it was authentic, at the entry time-stamped 6 minutes after sunset, which reads last light, daylight operations concluded per IC, an entry Priya swears on her life she never wrote, in handwriting that is unmistakably hers. My photocopy, the one I mailed to myself, arrived at my house in its envelope, sealed, postmarked, everything correct. Inside, the pages were our log, our letterhead, our timestamps. Daylight only, ending 6 minutes after sunset. The copy I made with my own hands at a print shop, that I watched come out of the machine, that I read in the car, daylight only. Priya's copy, the same. I do not know how. I have stopped trying to know how, because the how is the part Walt couldn't write down without sounding mad, and I finally understand that the institution and the canyon are not in a conspiracy together so much as the institution is simply the daylight-shaped scar tissue that grew over a wound it could never close. 100 years of administrators learning that the record cannot hold what happens after dark, that the dark edits itself out, that the only choice a sane person has is to write the daylight and let the night be unwritten, because the night will be unwritten whether you consent or not. Priya left the service within the year. We don't talk. The last thing she said to me was that she'd checked, and that Walt Brennan had died in his care facility the same night we held the trucks at the trailhead, a few hours before dawn, and that the staff said he'd been agitated all night, sitting up, talking to people who weren't there, and that the last thing he said, around the time the voices stopped out past the trucks, was a man's name, over and over, a name none of the staff recognized. They wrote it in his chart. It was Cole. I resigned. I've never gone back to that forest. I want to tell you I made peace with the choice, that holding the line was right, that Walt was a wise old man who saved my life and Beth's and Priya's and a dozen others. Some nights I believe that, but I keep coming back to the one thing I cannot get the daylight to cover, the detail that is the reason I finally decided to say all of this out loud, the reason I needed it written down somewhere that isn't a government file even though I know what happens to the things I write down. A month ago, Daniel Frey's sister called me. She tracked down my personal number. She wanted to thank me, she said, because the forest had finally sent her brother's effects, the personal items recovered from the slot, closure at last, and she was grateful that after all this time somebody had finally found his things. And she said the kindest thing. She said she was glad to have his compass back, their father's little brass compass, the one he never went anywhere without, the one I'd told you about at the start, and that it had come in a box with an official inventory sheet, signed and dated, recovered and logged by the service, all proper. I asked her what the date on the inventory was. The date it was recovered and logged. It was 3 weeks ago, daylight. Logged at 2:40 inches the afternoon. Recovering officer, badge number, and signature, all in order. The signature was mine. I have not set foot in that forest in 11 years. And I know my own hand, the way I drop the tail on the last letter when I'm in a hurry, and it was mine. Recovered at 2:40 inches the afternoon, in the daylight, where the record is allowed to hold, and I sat with the phone against my ear, and I understood that I never actually left, that some daylight version of me is still out there working that canyon, still logging the things that can be logged, still writing the report that stops before dark, and that the only part of me that ever got out is the part that's sitting here telling you this, in the night, where nothing I say will survive until morning.